chat with you this weekend. I thought you had a pretty darn good idea, and you said you were going to share it with the president. I want to know if you did, and that is this opposition leader in Venezuela that won the Nobel Prize that said it really deserved to go to Donald Trump. Sounds like a pretty good leader to me for the people of Venezuela and the end of narco-terrorism and a better relationship with the U.S. Or if they choose maybe the 51st state, I don't know.
Sounds good to me.
If you've been keeping up with American foreign policy lately, you've likely seen news about possible American intervention in Venezuela. The reasons justifying a supposed intervention are the same as always. Democracy needs to be brought to the people of Venezuela, the government is full of drug dealers, and that the Venezuelan people themselves are asking for an American intervention. Since the start of the second Trump presidency, the United States has been much more aggressive with Venezuela, repeatedly attacking boats along the coast of Venezuela that it alleges to be trafficking drugs to the US, attacks which have claimed the lives of 83 people. In addition, both air and naval military assets, such as bomber planes and aircraft carriers, have been sent to the American colonies of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, as have 10,000 troops. Recently, Trump has even stated the possibility of further airstrikes on Venezuelan land and has boasted that he has given the CIA permission to carry out lethal operations in Venezuela. The reason for this recent hostility is often simply said to just be oil, and while this isn't technically incorrect, I think there should be a deeper analysis conducted on how exactly the American government would take that oil, what steps they've already done to try to forcefully change the government in the past and present, and how consent is being manufactured for an invasion. In 1823, in a time when the US and the various European empires were still competing with each other for land and political influence in the global South, the fifth US President, James Monroe, signed into law the Monroe Doctrine. This was a colonial document that separated the world into two spheres of influence, stating that America would recognize all of Europe's colonies as legitimate in Asia and in Africa, and that the Americas would remain under the US's political influence. Any involvement of Europe in what the United States deems to be its backyard would be considered a threat to the American government. The Monroe Doctrine seems like an obvious relic of the colonial era that would have slowly faded away out of relevancy as the US and Europe have slowly transitioned to the liberal democracies of today. But instead, the US government has repeatedly cited the Monroe Doctrine as justification for its meddling in Latin America. Under Trump's first term, National Security Advisor John Bolton said, "In this administration, we are not afraid to use the phrase Monroe Doctrine. This, referring to Venezuela, is a country in our hemisphere. It's been the objective of presidents going back to Ronald Reagan to have a completely democratic hemisphere." In a proclamation available on the White House's official website, the U.S. government clearly states its position on this document in the 21st century. Today, my administration proudly reaffirms this promise under a new Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, that the American people, not foreign nations nor globalist institutions, will always control their own destiny in our hemisphere. In the centuries since, President Monroe's doctrine of sovereignty has guarded the American continents against communism, fascism, and foreign infringement, and as the 47th President of the United States, I am proudly reasserting this time-honored policy. In this address, Trump lists three things the doctrine has allegedly prevented: communism, fascism, and foreign infringement. In reality, the doctrine has only really helped prevent one of these three things, communism, and that only as a byproduct of the doctrine's true purpose, to keep the countries of South America complacent in a global economic system that benefits the United States with cheaper labor producing cheaper products, and of course, allows natural resources to be owned and sold by foreign capitalists. In reality, the United States has no problem with foreign infringement in Latin America when they are the ones doing the infringing. The US has helped overthrow governments in Cuba, in Argentina, in the Dominican Republic, in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Brazil, It established Operation Condor, a chain of political repression led by far-right American-supported military dictatorships that killed left-wing sympathizers across the entire continent, effectively erasing a generation of would-be revolutionaries and politicians, and set up the School of the Americas, a US-led military academy that still exists, by the way, that trained a generation of Latin American politicians and military generals in how to effectively repress and torture a population into submission. From Jorge Vidal, the dictator of Argentina, Hugo Banzer Suarez, the dictator of Bolivia, Raúl Iturriaga, the head of the secret police under Pinochet, several of the founders of the Mexican drug cartel Los Zetas, and Vladimiro Montesinos, the head of Peru's secret police and Fujimori's right-hand man. The U.S. Army School of the Americas is a school that has run more dictators than any other school in the history of the world. And those aren't my words, but the words of former U.S. Senator Joseph Kennedy II. And I haven't even mentioned Chile yet, where the democratically elected socialist Salvador Allende was couped by military general Augusto Pinochet with the encouragement and support of the United States, so that they could send US economists to test out their new economic theories by restructuring Chile's economy. If you want to learn more about American involvement in Latin America and how Latin America is economically exploited and kept poor by the US and Europe, I would highly recommend Eduardo Galeano's book, The Open Veins of Latin America. Clearly, the US isn't afraid of foreign intervention or of killing political opponents. They do that all the time. The Monroe Doctrine was written to keep European influence out of the Americas, but in the last few decades, that hasn't really been a big threat. Instead, the purpose of this doctrine has shifted from the US economy protecting it from Europe to the US economy protecting itself from Latin Americans themselves who are starting to resist their own exploitation. The biggest example of this is probably the Cuban Revolution, where Cubans themselves started fighting against the US-backed Batista dictatorship. I have a whole video on US-Cuba relations throughout history that you can watch here, but having Cuba be outside of American political influence was something that the Americans would try their hardest to prevent from happening again, which is why the United States has been focusing so much on Venezuela ever since the election of Hugo Chavez.
Para que sigamos haciendo patria.
For years, Venezuela was one of the most unequal countries in Latin America, where almost 80% of the population was living in poverty, more than 20% was unemployed, 4 million children suffered from malnutrition, more than half of the country lacked significant access to healthcare or education, and the slums bordering Caracas was one of the biggest in all of Latin America. This was life as an average worker of Venezuela's Fourth Republic, another South American neoliberal economy where the natural resources were privatized into the hands of a few descendants of European colonizers and their collaborators who enjoyed a life of luxury, while most Venezuelan workers saw next to nothing of the profits of their country's natural resources. Entire banks in Venezuela were owned by foreign companies. And it should be noted that all of this was completely fine by the US and Europe, who had good relations with Venezuela up until this point. In 1999, while running on a platform that appealed to the impoverished masses of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez was elected president, promising to reform the country, nationalize the foreign-owned banks, land, and oil companies, and use this money on social programs to help relieve the effects of poverty. And he did do a lot of what he promised to do. He took property away from large landlords, nationalized the aforementioned Spanish-owned Bank of Venezuela, and forcibly expropriated land and equipment owned by U.S. oil companies like ExxonMobil. A lot of the money made from this was then invested into said poverty alleviation programs, distributing food, setting up healthcare clinics for people who had never seen a doctor, and teaching people to read. I actually want to read part of an article on the effects of Chavez's policies because I think it will both make clear the real effect they had on normal people's lives and allow us to talk about how Western framing of poverty alleviation programs that helped millions is often twisted to demonize Chavez and the new Venezuelan government. The following article was published by CNN, a company that is not at all sympathetic to leftism or communism, and describes the effects of these poverty alleviation programs. The Venezuelan capital has its own favelas. Petare, a shantytown in western Caracas, is a painfully sobering example. It's an area that had been ignored and marginalized for decades. After coming to power in 1999, Chavez focused on developing welfare programs for the poor. The programs, called Misiones Sociales, have measurably reduced poverty in places like Petare. The poor, traditionally ignored and marginalized by Latin American politicians, became Chavez's main political weapon. It is true that Chavez squandered oil revenues, estimated at $120 billion a year, scared away investment by nationalizing foreign and domestic companies, and neglected the Venezuelan infrastructure. Spending $30 billion a year in social programs used as government propaganda while driving away foreign investment is unsustainable in the long term. For the outside world, at least, the inclusion of the poor will probably remain at the top of Chavez's legacy. The formula is so simple it makes you wonder why nobody thought of it before. After all, a 22-year-old single mother of two in Petare, Chapo Manguera, Chilmahuacan, or Ciudad Bolivar doesn't care about macroeconomic policies or free market economies, but about a leader who will make it possible to feed her children tomorrow. And to millions of Venezuelans, that was Hugo Chavez. The article also mentions a lot of stuff I skipped around. It talks about how Chavez centralized power, Venezuelan human rights abuses, which we'll talk about later, but this is the stuff relating to the poverty alleviation programs and how they were funded. As we can see, the policies of Chavez did help millions of poor people, so much so that even an organization as biased against him as CNN had to admit it in their article about his legacy after his death in 2013. Anyway, the part I really wanted to focus on was this part here in the middle, where CNN writes that Chavez squandered away $120 billion in oil revenue to use $30 billion in social programs, which the writer cynically refers to as government propaganda. Now let me rephrase this in a simpler, less scary way so that any normal person can understand what CNN is actually writing here. Because of the nationalization of Venezuela's natural resources, billions of dollars that would have previously gone to individuals were transferred to the state, who were able to spend said billions on poverty alleviation programs, the hiring of more government employees, and the expansion of its military after the most powerful country in the world began to threaten it, scaring away foreign investors who were afraid that the profit of the companies they invested in would be squandered away on the well-being of the people providing the labor and resources that make their income possible. As Chavez continued with his programs, the capitalists, both foreign and domestic, who were so used to having those billions of dollars going to them instead, began to become more hostile to him. He was officially separating from the American-led economic order that dictated the mass privatization of land, resources, and social services. All of this enabled Chavez to be able to help out Cuba by selling it oil, another red line for the US, since they have been attempting to starve out the Cuban Revolution via an illegal economic embargo on the country since the early 60s. As mentioned earlier, the Monroe Doctrine wanted American influence to be the dominant influence in South America, and that American influence trumped even the will of the democratically elected leader of Venezuela. And so, the US responded, as it always has in Latin America, by trying to overthrow the government. In 2002, the United States helped a small part of the Venezuelan military overthrow Chavez in a coup d'etat, and succeeded in doing so, for 2 days at least. When the new leader of Venezuela, someone who was coincidentally much more sympathetic to American business interests and immediately undid all of Chavez's reforms, was announced to be taking over for him, the demonstrations against the coup were so massive that Chavez and the military were able to come back to power 47 hours after being removed. There's actually a documentary called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised about these 2 days, and it goes into a lot of detail of how the Venezuelan media, still privately owned by capitalists who were still mad at him for taking their land and factories, deliberately lied on TV to justify the coup and paint all Chavez supporters as violent terrorists who were shooting random people in the streets. It's pretty interesting to watch. Obviously, this coup was an embarrassing failure for the US, but it did not prevent them from trying again in 2020. But of course, one can't only speak about the good things that Chavez did, because obviously a lot of the good he did is wearing off. I've often seen this graph posted on right-wing liberal subreddits without any context, so let me provide that for you. In the 90s, the poverty rate of Venezuelans was 80%. 4 out of 5 people were living in poverty. So what you're seeing here in the beginning of this graph, which most liberals will imply was how Venezuela was before Chavez, is actually the effects of his poverty alleviation programs in full effect. In just 4 years after his election, poverty fell by 20%, and just a few years after that, poverty fell by a full 50%. But then, starting in 2013 and 2014, a drastic spike in the rate of poverty. So, what happened in 2013 and 2014 that caused such a drastic difference to the quality of life in such a short time? For decades, Venezuela had been a petrostate, and the vast majority of its exports have been its oil. This isn't actually that uncommon in Latin America, where almost every country suffers from the same history of colonial rule and restructuring of its economy to primarily rely on a few commodity exports. Latin American countries have historically had their economies dominated by single commodity exports. For Cuba, it was sugar, for Colombia, it was bananas and coffee, and for Venezuela, it was oil. The reason so many of these countries in Latin America are so heavily dependent on exporting commodities is because when these countries were still being colonized, their European and American exploiters structured the economy to benefit them economically. So the Latin American country exports these raw resources like oil, gold, coffee, and so on for cheap to the first world, where they are either consumed for cheap or manufactured by American and European-owned companies. It's a really great deal for America because they get the raw material super cheap, and then they can sell it in its manufactured form and earn much more than if they had actually paid the people who did the work growing and mining the material in the first place. But for Latin American countries, it's also incredibly dangerous because not only does it prevent the host country from developing further than simply being a commodity export-oriented economy, but over-reliance on so few exports means that if suddenly the price for that export drops on the world market, it can be disastrous for your country's economy. And in Venezuela, oil alone makes up more than 80% of its exports. And for a few years, social services were largely funded with the profit off of this export. But in 2014, the oil price basically crashed because of developments happening in the market outside of Venezuela. And when I say crashed, I mean the price of oil fell by 70%, one of the worst crashes in the oil market since the Second World War. Obviously, for a country so desperately reliant on only oil exports, the effect of this crash was a disaster. Chavez isn't completely innocent in the extent that the oil crash affected his country. Obviously, it isn't his fault that the price of oil crashed or that the country he inherited was already set up like this decades before he became president. But he was president for almost 14 years, and he didn't do enough to develop Venezuela's economy past the clearly corrupt structure he inherited, which he himself identified as a problem. If anything, Venezuela became more dependent on oil exports after Chavez came to power, and this is one of the biggest things he should be criticized for. The Venezuela that Chavez inherited was one that was structured to be economically beneficial to America and Europe, and instead of developing his country beyond that structure, he stopped at the nationalization of businesses and land and used that money to treat the symptoms of the disease, the poverty and hunger of the Venezuelan masses, without addressing the actual disease itself, the colonialist structure of an underdeveloped economy almost entirely based on a single commodity export. In 2013, when the price of oil dropped, Venezuela began to suffer from a crisis born out of its economic structure. 9 years earlier, the US tried to overthrow the Venezuelan government with military force and it didn't work. But they didn't give up their ambitions to change Venezuela back to a country with a completely open economy. and in 2013, they were presented with exactly this opportunity. So, what did the United States do when they saw a country of more than 25 million people suffering? Sanction them, of course. In 2015, Obama implemented sanctions on Venezuela, sanctions that would be made even harsher by Trump just a few years later. To explain the effects of these sanctions, let me quote a UN report made in 2021. After describing the structure of Venezuela's economy, as I have here, the article states, unilateral sanctions increasingly imposed by the United States, the European Union, and other countries have exacerbated the above-mentioned challenges. The government's revenue was reported to shrink by 99%, with the country currently living on 1% of its pre-sanctions income. Remittances from abroad have decreased due to the blocking of state assets and the complexity of, and impediment to, bank transfers. Today, Venezuela faces a lack of necessary machinery, spare parts, electricity, water, fuel, gas, food, and medicine. Venezuelan assets frozen in United States, United Kingdom, and Portuguese banks amount to $6 billion. The purchase of goods and payments by public companies are reportedly blocked or frozen. The private sector, non-governmental organizations, universities, sport clubs, and citizens of Venezuela are reporting the rejection or reluctance of foreign banks to open or keep their bank accounts, including those with correspondent banks in the United States and Europe. Attempts to release funds frozen in the Bank of England for buying medicine, vaccines, protective kits, and medical equipment via the UNDP and PAHO in 2020 have failed. Since 2020, the United States has tried to block Venezuela from getting fuel from Iran by listing captains of oil tankers, prohibiting the use of Venezuelan air and seaports, and blocking assets of Rosneft. U.S. officials are reported to have made unofficial threats to prevent transactions by third-state companies with Venezuela. The Special Rapporteur underlines that unilateral sanctions against the oil, gold, and mining and other economic sectors, the state-owned airline, and the TV industry constitute a violation of international law. The Special Rapporteur notes with concern that sectoral sanctions on the oil, gold, and mining industries, the economic blockade of Venezuela, and the freezing of central bank assets have exacerbated pre-existing economic and humanitarian situation by preventing the earning of revenues and the use of resources to develop and maintain infrastructure and for social support programs, which has a devastating effect on the whole population of Venezuela, especially those in extreme poverty, women, children, medical workers, people with disabilities or life-threatening or chronic diseases, and the indigenous population. The Special Rapporteur underlines the inadmissibility of applying sanctions extraterritorially and urges the U.S. government to end the national emergency regarding Venezuela, revise and lift sectoral sanctions against Venezuela's public sector, review and lift secondary sanctions against third-state parties, and refrain from imposing sanctions on diesel supplies that would provoke a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented proportion. So, is Chavez and his policies partly to be blamed for the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela? Sure. But is the US and Europe also to be blamed for taking said humanitarian crisis and doing everything they can to make it worse? Also, yes. The reason the coup attempt in 2002 failed was because Chavez was an incredibly popular and charismatic leader who was well liked by Venezuelans, so before being able to try to overthrow the government again, they would need an unpopular leader. Now, Maduro had the very bad luck of becoming the president just when the oil crash happened, so even though these were the effects of Chavez's policies, most people blamed it on him, because the problem really started when he got into office. He is nowhere near as popular as Chavez was, and has been much more repressive against political opponents, not to mention the shady circumstances in which he's won some of his elections. That being said, I don't want to spend that much time on Maduro himself, because even if every single thing that American media said about him was true, that he rigged the elections, that he is a drug kingpin that literally every single Venezuelan hates, That still wouldn't justify an invasion of the country by the US. The US has no problem with working with literal monarchs who use slaves in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and has no problem implementing dictators in previously democratic countries. The issue at hand is truly the structure of the economy, and Maduro hasn't had that much to do with it. Venezuela was and still is in a desperate spot where millions of people live in poverty. In the last few years, the price of oil has risen, and countries like Iran and China have helped Venezuela out, so the situation is slightly better, but really only slightly. And it's exactly this condition that the US needs to carry out its current destabilization campaign. The Trump administration has claimed that drugs are being manufactured and sent to the US through Venezuela via a secret Cartel de los Soles that exists within the Venezuelan government. But that's a complete lie. Firstly, Cartel de los Soles is not a real cartel or organization, and just like the allegations that drugs coming into the US are made and sent by Venezuela, is also something that the United States has not provided any evidence for. Actually, the UN's own report on world drug manufacturing contradicts everything the US State Department claims. Contrary to the allegations made by Trump and Marco Rubio, most drugs coming into the US are not grown in Venezuela, but rather Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, the first two of which have typically been ruled by the right wing and are rather close allies to the US. And when it comes to trafficking drugs, a mere 5% of drugs made in Colombia are trafficked via Venezuela. All of these lies are repeated by government officials and republished by the allegedly independent American media with only the slightest hints of scrutiny. That is, of course, unless you're the New York Times and you openly advocate for American interference and regime change. But I would actually argue that American and European media is more directly involved in the manufacturing of consent than by just blindly repeating the state's position. And that's by the reporting they are doing on the drone strikes on random Venezuelan boats. No matter what company you're reading from, Fox, CNN, ABC, BBC, whatever, all of them continuously give credence to what the US government is saying. Even when the allegations are so clearly false, all of these organizations will report on it without ever doing the minimal amount of work to provide context, explain that what the American government is saying is demonstrably false, or trying to highlight the humanity of their military's victims. The US killed 83 human beings for no reason other than trying to threaten a government that they don't like. That's not something you should just report on neutrally. You should have a perspective. You should be mad that 83 people were killed by a government that alleges to be working on your behalf. This should be a more important story. Even if all of these people were confirmed drug smugglers heading to the US, that still wouldn't give the US the permission to just kill them. And the fact that the American media is just reporting on this as passively and neutrally as a local news station would report on a local traffic accident serves one purpose: normalizing violence against Venezuelans and Latin Americans more broadly. There's one last thing that I really feel the need to touch on, and that's the leader of the opposition, Maria Corina Machado. You may have heard her name in the news recently, touting her as a democracy advocate or Latin America's superwoman. But who is she really? I have literally no doubt in my mind when I say this, but the most obvious example of a politician constructed to serve American interests that has ever existed. Maria Corina Machado has been a politician in Venezuela since about the time Chavez was elected president, and from the beginning, it was clear who she was. She has been calling Chavez and then later Maduro a communist dictator since literally only a few years after he was elected to office. She funded an organization to quote-unquote monitor elections along with people who work with McKinsey and Company, an American multinational consulting firm worth billions of dollars that very clearly has vested economic interests in opposing Chavez's nationalization programs. This organization she helped found later tried to remove Chavez from power again in 2004 by holding a referendum, a second attempt that obviously also failed. On top of this, she was then charged with treason because it was discovered that she had been accepting money on behalf of foreign governments for her political work. Does anyone want to guess which government was paying her? And I haven't even mentioned the best part yet. Her family was one of the wealthiest in all of Venezuela because her father owned multiple steel and electricity companies. So in the 90s, when 80% of Venezuelans were suffering from poverty and half of the country was unemployed, she and her family and friends were enjoying a life of luxury in her villa in Caracas, and everything was fine. But the second her family's company is nationalized, suddenly she throws her life into politics because she loves democracy so much? No. Her only political position is that she is not Maduro and that she wants to make Venezuela a completely open neoliberal economy. In fact, let's watch this clip of her talking about some of her policies right now.
Forget about Saudi Arabia. Forget about the Saudis. I mean, we have more oil. I mean, infinite potential. And we're going to open markets. We're going to kick off the government from the oil sector. We are going to privatize all our industry. Venezuela has huge resources: oil, gas, minerals, land, technology. And as you said before, we have a strategic location, hours from the United States. So we're going to do this right. We know what we have to do. And American companies are in, super strategic position to invest. This country, Venezuela, is going to be the brightest opportunity for investment of American companies, of good people that are going to make a lot of money.
These positions are clearly meant to be heard by and appeal to Americans and Europeans, not your average Venezuelan who doesn't fall into Machado's description of good people who are going to make a lot of money. And that's because it doesn't matter what Machado can do for Venezuelans, but what Machado can do for Americans and Europeans who want to own Venezuelan resources and companies. But where you've most likely heard Machado's name pop up is in relation to her winning the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, it's funny because if you look at who else has actually gotten this Peace Prize before and just the overall history of the organization, Machado actually does deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. The prize is named after Alfred Nobel, a wealthy businessman who made much of his money by inventing weapons, and the yearly recipients of said Peace Prize are chosen by a handful of wealthy Norwegians. Notable recipients of this Peace Prize include Henry Kissinger and Barack Obama, both of whom are war criminals, but also some other quote-unquote pro-democracy advocates in countries that the West wants to destabilize. In 1991, Aung San Suu Kyi, a Burmese politician, won the Nobel Peace Prize for her political work and being a defender of freedom and democracy. But upon coming to power in 2016, her government's military carried out the Rohingya genocide, a crime that she still to this day denies ever happened. Another notable winner of this Peace Prize is Liu Xiaobo, a quote-unquote democracy and peace advocate in China. How one can be a peace and democracy advocate by being a vocal supporter of the Iraq War, American militarism, and the colonization of your own country is a question I won't attempt to answer. And no, I'm not joking. When he was asked what it would take to historically transform China, he clearly replied, "It would take 300 years of colonialism. I have my doubts as to whether 300 years would be enough." In reality, Machado deserves her spot as a Nobel Peace Prize recipient, a prize that she dedicated to Donald Trump after asking him to please invade her country. So Machado is, very clearly, a politician who exists to serve foreign interests, very shabbily constructed to act as a legitimate opposition leader in Venezuela. But how popular is Machado in Venezuela actually? When she started her career in politics, not popular at all. This was in the 2000s when most of Chavez's poverty relief programs were in full swing, and he enjoyed broad popular support after the dip in the early 2000s. She had her little rallies in the wealthy parts of Caracas that were attended by people of her same social status, and her being charged with treason didn't make her any more popular. In 2012, she tried to run for president, and the media in the US, UK, and Spain displayed wall-to-wall coverage of Machado as a brave voice of the oppressed Venezuelan people. In reality, though, she barely secured around 4% of the votes.
Por favor.
¿Cómo puede usted hablar de que respeta al sector privado en Venezuela cuando se ha dedicado a expropiar, que es robar? Cuando se ha dedicado a insultar, sí, las propiedades de empresarios, comerciantes, hasta pequeños posadas a quienes ni siquiera se le han resarcido su propiedad. Dígale la verdad a Venezuela. Aquí hay una Venezuela decente que quiere una transformación profunda y que es el momento de enfrentar con seriedad y con responsabilidad este desafío histórico que tenemos por delante. El tiempo se les acabó. Es el momento de una nueva Venezuela. Sí, acepte el debate, presidente.
Bien. Yo primero le sugiero que gane las primarias, ¿verdad? Gane usted las primarias. Es lo primero que tiene que hacer, porque está fuera de ranking para debatir conmigo. Está fuera de ranking. Lo lamento mucho. Lo lamento mucho. Pero esa es la verdad. Ya que usted me llamó hasta ladrón, así me llamó ladrón delante del país, no la voy yo a ofender. Águila no caza mosca, diputada. Bien.
But that was 15 years ago, before the collapse of oil prices, and a lot has changed since then. The fact of the matter is that today, millions of Venezuelans are hungry, and the living conditions have left a lot of people angry at their government. All of the context I've just provided for you here doesn't really matter to people that are starving and poor right now. It doesn't matter that they may disagree with Machado's policies, that the United States is attacking their country. What they want is immediate relief. In recent years, Machado's popularity in Venezuela has slightly grown, even though there are many Venezuelans conscious of the fact that she will be a horrible president. If it means an end to the problems they are dealing with, they will support it. Recent polls taken in Venezuela reveal that still 91% of Venezuelans hold an unfavorable opinion of Machado, 86% don't think she deserved the Nobel Peace Prize, and 93% of Venezuelans would be against foreign intervention, something that she is a strong vocal supporter of. But Venezuelans know if Machado were to become president, the US and Europe would lift their sanctions, and Venezuela would finally be allowed, for the first time in 10 years, to freely buy medicine, material to build infrastructure, and everything else that these sanctions have been preventing them from getting. But on the other hand, there is a part of Venezuela that has actually formed around the government now, vowing to protect it in case of an American attack. It's true that Maduro is an unpopular leader, but he's not so unpopular that the government still feels comfortable enough handing out guns and other weapons to civilians in case of an American invasion. And I want to get ahead here before it even happens, but private universities in Venezuela, owned and funded by the same people that Maria Corina Machado associates with, are already stating that these militias are just there to act as human shields, statements that are being published in the Western press. 3 years of genocide, with Israel claiming that hundreds of thousands of children and civilians that they murdered were used as human shields, and the Venezuelan far right, who are all Zionists, by the way, like the entirety of Latin America's far right, decides to use the same excuse. When a country is so clearly being militarily threatened, it's obvious that people will pick up a gun to defend their homes. So, if the US decides to actually bomb Venezuelan land, as they've threatened to do, they will be killing thousands of people living in poverty that Americans can't even imagine, all with the implicit justification already constructed that it was all inevitable because they were just human shields. The attacks on Venezuela's territory, the killing of random fishermen, all of that causes more people to rally and train to protect their country. So the big divide in Venezuela today is really between the people who want to pick up a gun and fight to keep their country independent, and people who want to stop suffering right now at any cost. And we, as people who are not in Venezuela, can't tell them what they should be doing. Whatever happens in Venezuela is something that needs to be decided by the people of Venezuela. What we in the Imperial Core can do, however, is take responsibility for our government's involvement in the ongoing humanitarian crisis. Venezuela has a lot of problems that lie within the economy and the government. Nobody is denying that, but the United States and Europe have done everything in their power to make the situation worse. There are billions of dollars sitting in banks in Europe and the US that belong to Venezuela that American sanctions are preventing them from using to buy medicine, to buy tools to repair equipment, to import food. And this war on Venezuela is not just to destabilize it, but also Cuba as well. Because of US sanctions, Cuba has a very difficult time getting just about anything imported. Just like Venezuela, they also have problems importing medicine and building material. For Cuba, it's very useful to be able to buy oil just from a country that is right next to it. But a Venezuela under a far-right party that wants to sell its oil companies to the US wouldn't be able to sell its oil to Cuba at all, making life for Cubans even harder than it already is. What we in the imperial core need to do is pressure our governments to end the military aggression and sanctions which are artificially worsening the already bad conditions. The US and the countries of Europe are only allowed to act the way they do because the people of these countries let them, either because they are too passive to care, or because they recognize they benefit from an imperialist system in which the US and Europe remain on top. And I'm not saying this because the governments of these countries listen to their population when it comes to foreign policy. Actually, that's demonstrably the opposite of reality. But what I am saying is that we, as all the working people of these countries, have more power than we think we do. The US and European media want to make you a passive actor. They want you to believe that all you can do is protest and vote. They want to distract you from the real harm our countries export to the rest of the world. The domestic issues of rising unemployment, living costs, and violence are intimately connected to the non-stop wars and poverty abroad, and you becoming educated and involved in these issues is, at the least, just as worthy of your time as whatever the new top show on Netflix is. You have more in common with one of those fishermen that were randomly murdered while going to work than the people in your government claiming to represent you. The very least we can do is to try to end American and European involvement in Venezuela's development.
¡Váyanse al carajo, yanquis de mierda! ¡Que aquí hay un pueblo digno! ¡Aquí hay un pueblo digno, yanquis de mierda! ¡Váyanse al carajo 100 veces!
Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed that video. The sources, as always, are in the description, along with a recommended reading list to learn more about the topic. I again would like to highly recommend the book Open Veins of Latin America. I apologize for the audio recording. I think there's different levels of quality, and also my energy level is pretty low. I've been sick for the last 2 weeks, almost 3 weeks now, and I keep just waiting to get healthy so I can record this voiceover in a better quality, and I just haven't been getting healthier. So I just decided to bite the bullet, and that's why it sounds like this. So hopefully in the next video, I'm back to my normal self. If you like what I do, you can support me on Patreon or with a one-time donation at Buy Me a Coffee. All Patreon supporters get exclusive audio-only previews before my videos are posted on YouTube, as well as the opportunity to vote in polls on what topics I cover next. If that sounds interesting to you, I'd love to have you in our little community. Thank you to my current supporters on Patreon, Cal, Dirk K, Finn Hammock, CMP6408, Dooley, Almudena Carrasco Pasos, Gabio Nontesi, Dangerman1973, Born Again Janice, and Yegi.